The Kido Butai floated silently through the Pacific, heading toward Honolulu, Hawaii. Their mission was to incite violence from the United States and bring about a devastating war in the Pacific, one they intended to win. However, over the course of just 3 short years, almost the entirety of the Imperial Japanese Navy would find itself at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. But why? Welcome to Fast Facts Friday. My name is Eleanor. Just a quick disclaimer for a younger audience before we dive in. This story may be disturbing to some, so viewer discretion is advised. Okay everyone, let's get into it. The Imperial Japanese Navy was the navy of the Empire of Japan from 1868 to 1945, following its dissolution after Japan's surrender in World War II. In its place, the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force, or JMSDF, was formed between 1952 and 1954 after the dissolution of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Prior to the Imperial Japanese Navy, Japan has had a long history of naval interaction with the Asian continent, beginning at least with the beginning of the Kofun period in the 3rd century AD. This is the earliest period of recorded history in Japan and is often referred to as the Yamato period. Fast forwarding to the 1640s, a long-standing policy for 200 years in Japan promoted seclusion from the rest of the world began. Following American warships entering Edo Bay and making demonstrations of force requesting trade negotiations, this policy would end. In 1854, the Convention of Kanagawa led to the opening of Japan to international trade and interaction. This was soon followed by the 1858 Treaty of Amity and Commerce, along with treaties with other powers. Japan was now more vulnerable and exposed than they'd been for the last 200 years, and in 1868, the Meiji Restoration led to the overthrow of the shogunate. From this point forward, the Meiji government continued with reforms to modernize and centralize Japan. The Meiji reformers were successful in overthrowing the Tokugawa shogunate. However, tensions continued and led to the Boshin War from January 1868 to June 1869. The early part of this conflict largely involved land battles, with naval forces playing a minimal role transporting troops from western to eastern Japan. The only significant naval battle was the Battle of Awa on January 28, 1868. Proving to be one of the few Tokugawa successes in the war. Tokugawa Yoshinobu eventually surrendered after the fall of Edo in July of 1868, however resistance continued in the north. The first naval review in Japan took place in Osaka Bay on March 26, 1868, with 6 ships from the private domain navies of Saga, Choshu, Satsuma, Kurume, Kumamoto, and Hiroshima participating. The total tonnage of all 6 ships was 2,252 tons, which was far smaller than the tonnage of one single French ship that also participated in the naval review. The next year, in July of 1869, the Imperial Japanese Navy was formally established following the end of the Boshin War. In February of 1868, the imperial government had placed all captured shogunate ships under the Navy-Army Affairs section. In the following months, military forces of the government came under the control of several organizations which were established and then disbanded until the establishment of the Ministry of War and of the Ministry of the Navy of Japan in 1872. For the first 2 years between 1868 and 1870, no national, centrally controlled navy existed. A former Tokugawa Navy leader, Katsu Kaishu, was brought into the government as Vice Minister of the Navy in 1872 and became the first Minister of the Navy from 1873 until 1878 because of his naval experience and his ability to control Tokugawa personnel who retained positions in the government naval forces. In February of 1872, the Ministry of War was replaced by a separate Army Ministry and Navy Ministry. In October of the following year, Katsu Kaishu became Navy Minister. The Imperial Japanese Navy was only just beginning. And we are just getting started. If you are enjoying this episode and want to hear more about ships, their careers, and their wrecks, check out our main show, Shipwreck Sunday, every Sunday night at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Okay friends, let's look further into the IJN. After the consolidation, the new Meiji state set about to build up national strength. They honored the treaties with the Western powers signed during the Bakumatsu period with the ultimate goal of revising them, leading to a subsided threat from the sea. However, due to this, there was conflict with disgruntled samurai who wanted to expel the Westerners and with groups that opposed the Meiji reforms. Internal dissent, which included peasant uprisings, became a great concern for the government, curtailing plans for naval expansion as a result. Naval policy focused on coastal defenses, a standing army, and a coastal navy that could act in a supportive role to drive an invading enemy from the coast. The resulting military organization followed the Army First, Navy Second principle. This meant a defense designed to repel an enemy from Japanese territory, and their main objective rested on Japan's army. Consequently, the Army gained the bulk of the military expenditures. Even into the 1870s and 1880s, the Imperial Japanese Navy remained an essentially coastal defense force, although the Meiji government continued to modernize it. In 1870, an imperial decree declared Britain's Royal Navy as the role model for the IJN instead of the Netherlands Navy. In 1873, a 34-man British naval mission led by Lieutenant Commander Archibald Douglas arrived in Japan, and he directed instruction at the Naval Academy at Tsukiji for several years, remaining in Japan until 1879. This substantially advanced the development of the Navy and firmly established British traditions within the Japanese Navy, from matters of seamanship to the style of its uniforms and the attitude of its officers. Ships like the first Fuso, Kongo, and Hiei were built in British shipyards, and they were the first warships built abroad specifically for the IJN. All three were sold for scrap between 1909 and 1911. Private construction companies like Ishikawajima and Kawasaki also emerged around this time. Moving into the 1880s and 1890s, the Imperial Japanese Navy went through a period of expansion. After the Imo Mutiny in July of 1882, Iwakura Tomomi submitted a document to the Daijokan titled Opinions Regarding Naval Expansion, asserting that a strong navy was essential to protecting Japan. He suggested that domestic rebellions were no longer Japan's primary military concern, and that naval affairs should take precedence over army concerns, meaning a strong navy was more important than a sizable army. He went on to justify that a large, modern navy would have the potential benefit of instilling Japan with greater international prestige and recognition, being that navies were internationally recognized hallmarks of status and power. To support the growth of the navy, Iwakura suggested the Meiji government increase taxes on sake, soy, and tobacco. After lengthy discussions, Iwakura eventually convinced the ruling coalition to support Japan's first multi-year naval expansion plan in history. In May of 1883, the government approved a plan that, when done, would add 32 warships over 8 years at a cost of just over 26 million yen. This was significant as the amount allocated virtually equaled the Navy's entire budget between 1873 and 1882, and this naval expansion was a success in large part because of Satsuma power, influence, and patronage. By March of 1883, the Navy secured 6.5 million yen required annually to support an 8-year expansion plan, and this was the largest that the Imperial Japanese Navy had secured in its young existence. Despite this victory, naval expansion remained a contentious topic for both the government and Navy throughout much of the 1880s. Technology advanced overseas so much so that the costs of purchasing large components of a modern fleet caused massive cost overruns by 1885, jeopardizing the 1883 expansion plan. Increased costs coupled with the decreased domestic tax revenues only heightened concern and political tension in Japan regarding funding naval expansion. The newest French doctrine, the Jean Nicole, favored small, fast warships, especially cruisers and torpedo boats, which would become destroyers later on. This influence spread around the world, challenging the current worldview that battleships were the best offense on the seas. We go into more detail on that in our History of Destroyers video, so make sure to check that one out. Where it applies here is that France and Japan were more friendly at the time than Japan and the British due to England's closeness with China, so Japan began to adopt this doctrine. In 1882, of the 48 warships being built, 22 were torpedo boats. In 1885, the leading French Navy engineer, Émile Bertin, was hired for 4 years to reinforce the Japanese Navy and to direct the construction of the arsenals of Kure and Sasebo. He developed the Sankeiken class of cruisers as well as supervising the construction of more than 20 ships total. This period allowed Japan, quote, to embrace the revolutionary new technologies embodied in torpedoes, torpedo boats, and mines, of which the French at the time were probably the world's best exponents. The Japanese acquired their first torpedoes in 1884, establishing a torpedo training center at Yokosuka in 1886. Despite their closeness with France, Japan still ordered ships from Great Britain from 1887 up until 1918. At this point, following the visit of the French military mission to Japan, the Imperial Japanese Navy stopped relying on foreign instructors altogether. In 1886, the IJN manufactured their own prismatic powder, and in 1892, one of the officers of the IJN invented a powerful explosive called shimose powder. The first major conflict that the IJN would take part of as a unified front was the First Sino-Japanese War from 1894 to 1895. Japan continued modernizing their navy, driven by Chinese efforts to construct a powerful modern fleet with foreign assistance, especially that of the Germans, and as a result of this, tensions started to rise between the two nations over competing interests in Korea. Japan would dance around the possibility of going to war just yet, as they awaited several modern warships ordered in February of 1893, particularly the battleships Fuji, Yashima, and the cruiser Akashi. The main goal of the Japanese in this conflict was to quickly gain naval superiority, since this was critical to subsequent operations on land. An early victory over the Beiyang fleet allowed Japan to transport troops and material to the Korean peninsula, and additionally, the Japanese judged the protracted war with China would increase the risk of intervention by the European powers with interests in East Asia. However, if the combined fleet were to win decisively at sea, the larger part of the Japanese army could immediately land in force on the Korean coast between Shanhaiguan and Tianjin in order to defeat the Chinese army and swiftly end the war. If the combined fleet was defeated and then lost command at sea, the bulk of the army would remain in Japan and prepare to repel a Chinese invasion, while the 5th Division in Korea would be ordered to dig in and fight a rearguard action. The Japanese, however, would do very well. The Chinese Beiyang fleet was crippled during battle in September of 1894 and retreated behind the Waiheiwai fortifications, only to be surprised by Japanese troops that had outflanked the harbor's defenses in coordination with the IJN. The remnants of the Beiyang fleet were destroyed at Waiheiwai, and Japan emerged victorious at sea. Despite this victory, the two German-built Chinese battleships Dingguan and Zhenyuan had remained almost impervious to Japanese guns, showing the need for bigger capital ships in the IJN. The next step of the Imperial Japanese Navy's expansion would thus involve a combination of heavily armed large warships with supplementary smaller warships. After the Japanese victory, moving toward the next century, the Imperial Japanese Navy intervened in China in 1900 by participating with Western powers in the suppression of the Chinese Boxer Rebellion. The Japanese Navy supplied the largest number of warships, 18 out of 50 total, and delivered the largest contingent of troops among the intervening nations, a total of 20,840 Imperial Japanese Army and Navy soldiers out of a total of 54,000. This conflict allowed Japan to engage in combat alongside Western nations and to acquire first-hand understanding of their fighting tactics. Following rising tensions between Japan and Russia, the Imperial Japanese Navy would take part in the Russo-Japanese War from 1904 to 1905. The Russian Navy was almost completely annihilated in a lopsided battle, with 21 out of 38 Russian ships being sunk, 7 captured, and 6 disarmed. 4,545 Russian servicemen were killed and 6,106 taken prisoner. Conversely, the Japanese only lost 3 torpedo boats and 116 men. These victories broke Russian naval strength in East Asia and triggered waves of mutinies in the Russian Navy at Sevastopol, Vladivostok, and Kronstadt, peaking in June with the Potemkin uprising. This greatly contributed to the Russian Revolution of 1905, and the Japanese victory elevated the status of their navy at home and abroad. In 1905, Japan acquired their first submarines from the Electric Boat Company out of the United States. This is just 4 years after the U.S. Navy commissioned its own first submarine, USS Holland. These 5 Japanese submarines were Holland designs as well, being assembled at Yokosuka and becoming operational at the end of 1905. Japan would enter World War I against Germany and Austria-Hungary as a consequence of the 1902 Anglo-Japanese alliance. At the Siege of Tsingtao, the IJN supported the capture of the German colony at Jiaozhou Bay, and during the siege beginning on September 5, 1914, IJN's Wakamaya carried out the world's first successful sea-launched airstrikes. On September 6, 1914, the world's first air-sea battle in history began with Wakamaya attacking the Austro-Hungarian cruiser Kaiserin Elisabeth and the German gunboat Jaguar off Qingdao. An IJN battle group also patrolled the Central Pacific Ocean between August and September of 1914 to pursue the German East Asia Squadron, which turned into the Southern Atlantic where they encountered the British and were destroyed. Japan also captured possessions in northern Micronesia and held these until the end of World War II. The UK was stuck between a rock and a hard place, and asked Japan to be loaned their 4 newly built Kongo-class battlecruisers, Kongo, Hiei, Haruna, and Kirishima. However, this request was denied. The British pleaded Japan for more help following the initiation of unrestricted submarine warfare by Germany, so in March of 1917, the Japanese then sent a special force to the Mediterranean to bail out the British. This force was based in Malta and protected Entente shipping between Marseille, Taranto, and ports in Egypt until the end of the war. By the end of the war, Japan had escorted 788 Entente transports. They also began exporting naval hardware during World War I. In 1917, they exported 12 Arabe-class destroyers to France. In 1918, ships like Azuma were assigned to act as convoy escorts in the Indian Ocean between Singapore and the Suez Canal as part of Japan's commitments to the UK under the Anglo-Japanese alliance. After the conflict, the IJN received 7 German submarines as war reparations. These submarines were brought to Japan and analyzed, contributing greatly to the development of the Japanese submarine industry. The most notable events during the time between World Wars I and II for the IJN are the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 and the development of aircraft carriers. The Washington Naval Treaty limited the expansion of the Western Pacific fortifications of the United States, Britain, and Japan. Japan was specifically barred from expanding to the Kuril Islands, the Bonin Islands, Amami-Oshima, and the Luchu Islands, Formosa, and the Pescadores. Japan was also only allocated 315,000 tons for capital ships, and that maximum displacement per ship could not exceed 35,000 tons. A consistent weakness of Japanese warship development led to the tendency to incorporate excessive firepower and engine output relative to ship size, leading to shortcomings in stability, protection, and structural design. Many of the nations of the Washington Naval Treaty began to step outside of these parameters, and the subsequent mini-arms race only heightened rising tensions across the globe leading into World War II. World War II officially began with the Nazi German invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939. Unofficially, some historians credit the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in September of 1931 as the beginning of the conflict, and the Japanese entered the war in the Pacific with the United States following their attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The Imperial Japanese Navy had devoted a large number of resources to create a force of superior quality than that of the United States prior to the events at Pearl Harbor. Particularly, Japan had invested in the vital area of anti-submarine warfare and in specialized training to support this. However, their reluctance to utilize their submarine fleet for commerce raiding and failure to comprehensively secure its seaborne communications would ultimately contribute to their defeat in the Pacific War. They also underinvested in intelligence, and this lack of information about the U.S. Navy is credited as another major factor in their defeat. However, during the first 6 months of the Pacific War, the IJN enjoyed several spectacular successes, with crushing defeats inflicted upon the Allied forces across a large portion of the Pacific Ocean. Japanese naval aircraft were responsible for the first time capital ships had been sunk by aerial attack while underway, and these 2 first victims were HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse. The April of 1942 Indian Ocean raid largely drove the Royal Navy out of Southeast Asian waters. After this, Japan moved into the Battle of the Coral Sea, where they were forced to abandon their attempts to isolate Australia. The defeat in the Midway Campaign was another harsh blow that cost the Japanese 4 fleet carriers and most of the aircrew on these ships. The following campaign of the Solomon Islands from August 1942 to February 1943 was devastating for the Japanese, compounding with previous defeats and highlighting the accelerating degradation of the IJN's capabilities. During 1943, American industrial strength began to turn the tide, and ultimately, they began to get the upper hand through vastly greater industrial output, a modernization of their air and naval forces, and the inability of Japan to replace lost air and naval power. From the end of 1943 to 1944, Japan's defensive perimeter on held islands in Micronesia failed to hold. Yet another massive defeat was the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944, with the bulk of IJN's largely irreplaceable and veteran carrier pilots being shot down. The IJN's carrier fleet would never recover, with American pilots coining the lopsided naval air battle the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. 4 months later, in October of 1944, Japan attempted to interdict American amphibious landings at Leyte Gulf, and it, too, was disastrous. During the last phase of the war, Japan was desperate, even utilizing kamikazes, which were suicide attack planes that would fatally crash into Allied warships to inflict massive amounts of damage. By May of 1945, much of the IJN was sitting at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, and the surviving warships had retreated to home waters due to the lack of fuel and inability to contend with overwhelming American naval power. In late July of 1945, most of the remaining large warships of the IJN were sunk at anchor in air attacks at Kure and the Inland Sea. By August 1945, Nagata was the only surviving capital ship of the Imperial Japanese Navy, and if you want to hear about what happened to her, make sure to check out our episode on her. The Imperial Japanese Navy was once a force to be reckoned with. However, over the course of World War II, they saw losses they could not reconcile with, leading to the downfall of the Japanese Empire as a whole. The ships of the IJN were still incredible, despite the fates many of them faced. If you liked that story and wanted to hear something similar, check out our Imperial Japanese Warships playlist in the cards. Stay tuned this Sunday for the career of IJN Issei, an Imperial Japanese battleship that survived World War I and World War II, only to face the scrapyard. Thank you for tuning in to Fast Facts Friday, have a lovely weekend, and we'll see you next time.